Luis woke up early as usual. The sun had not yet climbed fully into the sky, but the quiet hum of the town already signaled the start of a new day. He stretched, rubbed his hands, and prepared for work. Being a plumber was not easy, but it was honest work, and Luis took pride in helping people solve their problems. Pipes leaking in the middle of the night, clogged drains, or broken faucets. He fixed them all. It was simple work, but it brought him satisfaction. After finishing his morning routine, Luis put on his worn-out shoes, grabbed his toolbox, and walked outside. The streets were calm, with the occasional rooster crowing or shopkeeper opening his doors. Luis's old pickup truck waited for him at the corner, its paint faded and engine humming softly. He loaded his tools, checked the tires, and started driving toward his first appointment. Life had become quiet for Luis after leaving his previous career behind. Years ago, he had worked as a CIA field agent. He had traveled the world, worked on complicated missions, and faced challenges most people could not imagine. That part of his life was behind him, though. Now all he wanted was peace. No missions, no secrets, just a simple life helping his neighbors. Luis rarely spoke about his past, not even to his closest friends. After a long morning fixing a stubborn leak in an elderly woman's house, Luis decided to stop by the local gas station. It was small and familiar, the kind of place where everyone knew your name. He needed to fill his truck and grab some water before moving on to his next job. When he arrived, the usual chatter of the attendants and customers greeted him. Children laughed nearby, and the smell of fresh bread from a corner bakery drifted into the air. It was comforting. Luis parked his truck and stepped inside the gas station. He greeted the cashier with a smile and waved at a few neighbors. Life felt simple and steady, but today something felt different. A group of men entered the gas station. They wore flashy clothes, gold chains, and expensive watches. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere. The chatter quieted, and people began to give them space. Luis noticed them, but he continued with his business, quietly filling his water bottle and checking the truck's fuel. The men moved around loudly, pushing past customers and laughing as if they owned the place. One of them, taller than the rest and wearing dark sunglasses, noticed Luis. He walked over slowly, deliberately bumping into him. A soda spilled over Luis's shirt. The man laughed and made a comment about Luis being poor and weak. Others joined in, making fun of him, trying to provoke a reaction. Luis stayed calm. His face showed nothing, but inside a storm of memories and skills stirred. Years of training, strategy, and precision came rushing back. Every movement he had learned during his time as an agent now whispered in his mind. He did not need to respond with anger or force. He could handle this situation carefully, using his intelligence and observation. He noticed small details about the men. How they moved, how they talked, how they reacted to each other. Their arrogance made them careless. Luis smiled faintly to himself. These men thought they were powerful and untouchable. They had no idea that the quiet plumber in front of them had once outsmarted people far more dangerous than this. Luis calmly cleaned himself with a napkin, not letting his expression change. He even said softly, "It's okay. Accidents happen." His calmness confused them. They expected fear, anger, or at least a reaction that would give them control. Luis gave them nothing. He simply focused on the task at hand, waiting for the right moment to act, though his action would not involve violence. His mind was sharp, planning, and always alert. The men laughed again and moved on to the snack section, ignoring Luis for now. But Luis's calm observation did not stop. He remembered every detail of their behavior, every flaw, every movement. He knew that even a group of men like this could be handled with patience and careful thinking. Luis's life may have seemed ordinary now, but his past gave him skills that no one around him could even imagine. As he paid for his items and stepped outside, Luis's calm eyes scanned the men one last time. The sun was higher now, lighting the small town with a soft golden glow. Today might seem like a simple day to the town, but Luis knew that sometimes ordinary life hid extraordinary challenges. He was ready for whatever came next, even if no one around him knew who he truly was. Luis returned to his small apartment after finishing his plumbing jobs for the day. The sun was dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the town. He felt the quiet relief of a day nearly done, but something about the gas station earlier did not sit right. The men who had harassed him were not ordinary troublemakers. Their movements, their laughter, and even the way they surveyed the area felt deliberate, Luis had a keen eye for patterns, a skill honed during his past life, and he sensed that this encounter was not just random. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the streets below. The town seemed peaceful, with children finishing their games and shopkeepers locking doors for the evening. Yet Luis's mind remained alert. He thought carefully about the men in the situation. What had brought them to the gas station? Why had they singled him out? His instincts told him to stay calm, but also to observe carefully. He knew that thinking ahead was often more powerful than acting too quickly. The next morning, Luis decided to take an early walk through the town. He wanted to see if the men were still around or if it had been a one-time incident. The town's market was busy with vendors setting up their stalls. People greeted each other cheerfully, unaware of the subtle tension in Luis's mind. As he walked past the bakery, he noticed a familiar face from yesterday, the tall man with dark sunglasses standing near the street corner. He was speaking quietly to two others, occasionally glancing around as if checking for someone. Luis slowed his pace and pretended to examine a display of fruits, keeping the men in his sight. He noted everything: the way they leaned against the walls, their gestures, and even how they reacted to pedestrians passing by. These small observations gave him clues. They were trying to intimidate, to show control over the area, and they were careful not to draw too much attention. Luis smiled faintly. They did not know that their plans were visible to him. Returning home, Luis considered his options. Confrontation was not necessary, and unnecessary attention could cause problems for the people around him. Instead, he decided to gather more information quietly. He made a list of what he had seen, thinking through their possible motivations. The more he analyzed, the clearer it became. The men were trying to establish control over the area, probably as part of their larger network. They did not realize that Luis's calm exterior hid a mind trained to anticipate their next move. Over the next few days, Luis continued his plumbing work, but he remained vigilant. He observed patterns in the men's appearances, noting when they came and went, how they interacted with locals, and how they reacted to authority figures. Luis even noticed small mistakes, signs of overconfidence, brief moments of distraction, and ways they relied on others to support them. These were weaknesses that Luis could use, not through force but through clever planning. Luis also made small preparations. He fixed small issues in his home and truck to ensure nothing would catch him off guard. He practiced patience, watching and waiting. During quiet moments, he thought back to training exercises he had done years ago, remembering strategies for observation, timing, and subtle influence. Luis understood that knowledge was more powerful than immediate action. With careful thought, he could turn the situation in his favor without putting himself or others in danger. One afternoon, as he returned to the gas station for supplies, Luis noticed something unusual. The men had parked outside in a way that suggested they were watching the entrance, possibly waiting for someone. He smiled inside. Patience and careful observation would allow him to control the situation without revealing his abilities too soon. Every move they made gave him more information, and he remained calm, friendly, and unassuming in their presence. Luis paid for his items and walked out, nodding politely to the men. They barely acknowledged him, confident that he posed no threat. But Luis knew otherwise. He had time, knowledge, and a plan forming in his mind. These men were loud and careless, but he had the quiet power of intelligence, patience, and skill. The game had begun, and Luis was ready. As the sun set and the town prepared for night, Luis returned home, knowing that the coming days would require both caution and cleverness. He was determined to protect his peaceful life, and he was certain that the men would not realize who they were dealing with until it was too late. Luis woke up early, just as he had every morning. The town was quiet, and a soft breeze carried the smell of flowers and fresh bread. He brewed his coffee slowly, thinking about the men who had caused trouble at the gas station. Their presence lingered in his mind, but instead of worry, he felt focus. Luis had always believed that calm observation and clever planning could solve almost any problem. He decided to spend the morning at the gas station again, but this time, he had a purpose. While filling his truck with fuel, he paid close attention to every detail. The men were there, sitting in a car parked across the street. They watched the entrance, laughing quietly and checking their phones. Luis smiled slightly. Their confidence was clear, but it also made them careless. Luis made a mental note of their patterns. He noticed the times they arrived, the way they reacted when someone walked by, and even which of them took the lead when making decisions. Every detail gave him information. Knowledge, he thought, was the first step to turning the situation in his favor. After finishing his small shopping at the store, Luis walked to a nearby bench to rest. He pretended to scroll on his phone, but in reality, he observed the men without appearing to do so. They were loud and flashy, trying to impress each other and anyone watching. Luis noticed their overconfidence, the way they underestimated everyone around them, and the small mistakes they made when no one else was looking. By late morning, Luis had developed a plan not to confront them directly, but to make them overestimate him in a way that would cause them to reveal more of their intentions. He thought carefully about every step. Small actions, subtle gestures, and quiet intelligence could shift the situation without anyone realizing it. Luis had learned long ago that even the smartest people could be guided by perception and timing. That afternoon, Luis returned to the town market, carrying his tools for a small plumbing job. He walked past the men's car, nodding politely. One of the men smirked at him, expecting a reaction. Luis's calm smile and casual greeting surprised them. They were sure he would act angrily or fearfully, but Luis gave them nothing. His quiet confidence made them uneasy, though they did not understand why. Luis spent the rest of the day completing his plumbing jobs, but he continued to watch the men's movements. Each time they tried to act important or intimidating, Luis observed and learned. He even noticed which local businesses they visited, how they interacted with other people, and what distracted them. All these small observations were pieces of a larger puzzle. That evening, Luis went to a quiet cafe to relax and think. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He sipped his tea while reviewing the day's information. His mind worked like a map, connecting details, predicting possible outcomes, and preparing strategies. He realized that the men were not just random troublemakers. They were testing the town, trying to establish influence. Luis knew he had to act, but cleverly. Instead of confrontation, Luis decided on small, controlled actions to guide their behavior. For example, he left tools and supplies in places where they might notice them, suggesting that he had connections or resources they did not understand. He walked with confidence, choosing routes that passed near the men, showing that he moved freely without fear. Each subtle action planted questions in their minds. By the end of the day, Luis returned home feeling satisfied. The men were still around, but they were beginning to doubt their assumptions. They had expected fear or weakness, but instead they found calm intelligence, patience, and subtle influence. Luis knew that the coming days would require even more careful planning. He had begun to guide the situation, making the men reveal themselves without realizing it. As night fell, Luis prepared for rest. The town seemed peaceful, but Luis knew better. Small challenges could grow quickly if ignored. He smiled faintly, confident in his quiet abilities. The men had underestimated him, and that mistake would give him the advantage. Luis's ordinary life as a plumber remained, but beneath it his mind was sharp, ready, and in control. The next morning, Luis woke up before the sun. His mind was already planning the day ahead. He knew that patience and observation were key. The men at the gas station were confident, loud, and careless. Their arrogance made them predictable, and Luis intended to use that to his advantage. He dressed in simple clothes, grabbed his toolbox, and left quietly, as if it was an ordinary day. When he reached the gas station, the men were already there, sitting in their car and laughing. Luis walked past them slowly, carrying his toolbox. He nodded politely and smiled, showing no fear or anger. One of the men smirked, expecting a reaction. Luis simply waved back and continued walking. Inside, he bought some water and snacks, keeping his eyes subtly on the group. He noticed the small things they did, how they leaned on the car, the way they whispered to each other, and how they sometimes glanced around as if they were waiting for someone. Luis decided to make a small move. He left one of his tools leaning against the gas pump, casually adjusting it as if he had just finished a minor repair. It was a simple action, but it suggested he had been working in the area and knew the surroundings well. The men noticed it immediately. They exchanged glances, whispering quietly, their confidence showing small cracks. Luis smiled inwardly. A subtle action could sometimes create more doubt than confrontation. After finishing at the gas station, Luis moved on to a plumbing job at a nearby house. While working, he carefully observed the streets outside. He noticed the same men parked a few blocks away, seemingly watching the area. Luis did not panic. He continued his work calmly, pretending to be fully focused on the plumbing, but in reality he was collecting information. Their movements, timing, and behavior told him more than any words could. Luis realized that the men were trying to establish control over the town in small ways, testing the people, and observing reactions. Their actions were noisy, but their strategy was clumsy. Luis decided to use this to his advantage. He left small marks of his presence at the locations he visited, tools, footprints, or the careful adjustment of objects, enough to suggest he was aware of their movements. Every small gesture was like a message they could not fully understand. That afternoon, Luis went to a cafe near the market. He sat in a corner, quietly observing the men who had followed him from the gas station. They seemed confused now, trying to understand why he moved so calmly and why he seemed aware of their presence. Luis noted their conversations from a distance, catching fragments about their plans and their assumptions about his weakness. He smiled faintly. Their arrogance had blinded them to his true abilities. Luis also planned to create small distractions that would test their reactions. He thought about the safest ways to do it without creating harm, using observation and careful timing instead. For example, he left a small note near a local store where the men would see it, hinting at knowledge of their presence. Their reactions were exactly as he predicted. They grew cautious, whispered to each other, and changed positions slightly. Luis's plan was working. By evening, Luis returned home carrying the satisfaction of the day's small victories. He did not need confrontation or force to gain an advantage. Every observation, every subtle move, and every quiet gesture made the men doubt themselves. Luis's mind worked like a quiet storm, calm on the surface but powerful underneath. Before sleeping, Luis reviewed the day's events. The men were beginning to underestimate the ordinary plumber, but they were also showing signs of doubt. Luis smiled, knowing that his plan was unfolding exactly as he intended. The quiet patience, subtle intelligence, and careful observation would continue to guide him. The men might think they were in control, but Luis had already started guiding their actions without them realizing it. As night fell over the town, the streets were calm and peaceful. Children played quietly, neighbors chatted, and the usual hum of evening life continued. Luis lay down feeling ready for the days ahead. He was determined to protect his peaceful life. The men had no idea who they were dealing with, and that advantage belonged entirely to Luis. The next morning, Luis woke with the calm energy of someone who had already planned the day in his mind. He knew that the men at the gas station had started noticing his subtle actions. Their arrogance was fading, replaced with curiosity and slight nervousness. Luis drank his coffee slowly, thinking about how to continue guiding their behavior without causing panic or harm. He decided to visit the local market first. Vendors were arranging fruits and vegetables, greeting customers cheerfully. Luis moved through the market with ease, carrying his toolbox and a small bag of supplies. From a distance, he saw the same men sitting in a car nearby. They were whispering to each other, glancing at Luis frequently. Their body language had changed. Their confidence seemed thinner, like it could break at any moment. Luis smiled quietly to himself. His previous days of observation had given him an advantage. He knew where they would sit, when they would move, and how they would react. Today, he planned to test them further using small, clever signals to make them reveal more about their intentions. While walking past a small cafe, Luis pretended to tie his shoe, taking extra time as if he was distracted. In reality, he was observing the men's reactions. One of them quickly looked around, then whispered to the others. They seemed tense, uncertain about whether Luis had noticed them or was aware of their presence. Luis continued walking casually, giving nothing away. Every gesture, every step was a calculated move. Later, Luis visited a nearby house to fix a leaky faucet. While working, he noticed movement in the street outside. The men were following him again, trying to appear casual. Luis focused on his work, but made sure to leave subtle signs that he knew they were watching. He tapped lightly on the faucet, adjusted a small tool on the counter, and glanced toward the window where they could see him. Each small action hinted at awareness without confronting them directly. Luis understood that his subtle moves were making them nervous. Their overconfidence was fading, replaced with a growing suspicion. They whispered more, checked their phones repeatedly, and even glanced around as if expecting someone else to arrive. Luis had planted the seed of uncertainty. Now he needed to continue growing it carefully. After finishing the plumbing job, Luis walked through the town square, carrying nothing but his toolbox. He casually interacted with people, greeting neighbors and stopping briefly to chat. Every move was natural and unassuming. The men, still watching from a distance, were struggling to understand him. To them, he was just a simple plumber. But Luis knew that his quiet confidence and careful observation made him more powerful than they realized. By late afternoon, Luis returned to his apartment to review the day. He jotted notes about the men's actions, times, and locations. He reflected on how each small gesture had influenced their behavior. His plan was simple: guide them without force, confuse them without fear, and make them reveal more than they intended. Luis understood that cleverness often won battles that brute force could not. That evening, Luis went out for a short walk to stretch his legs. The streets were calm, with children playing quietly and neighbors finishing their evening chores. From a distance, he noticed the men again. They had moved closer, parked near the cafe, and were watching the street intently. Luis continued walking slowly, casually greeting anyone he passed. His calm demeanor unsettled them. They were beginning to realize that this plumber was not ordinary, but they did not yet know why. Luis returned home as night fell, feeling satisfied. The day had gone exactly as planned. He had tested their reactions, observed their behavior, and strengthened his advantage without confrontation. The men's growing suspicion meant that they were starting to underestimate themselves, and that was exactly what Luis wanted. As he prepared for sleep, Luis reflected on the situation. His ordinary life as a plumber seemed peaceful, but his mind remained alert and strategic. He had begun to control the situation subtly, and the coming days would be even more important. The men had no idea who they were dealing with, and that gave him the quiet power to protect his town and his life. Luis lay down, ready for the next day. Patience, intelligence, and observation were his tools, and he knew that careful planning could achieve what others might think impossible. The game had moved to a new level, and Luis was prepared for whatever clever challenges came next. Luis woke up before sunrise, feeling calm but alert. The town was quiet, with only the soft sound of roosters crowing and a few birds flying across the sky. He sipped his coffee slowly, reviewing the events of the past days. The men at the gas station had begun to show signs of nervousness. Their arrogance had started to fade, replaced with confusion and uncertainty. Luis knew it was time to use this to his advantage. He grabbed his toolbox and left quietly, walking toward the main street. As he passed the familiar streets of his town, he noticed the men's car parked nearby. They were watching the street carefully, as if expecting someone important. Luis walked casually, pretending not to notice, but in reality, he observed their positions, reactions, and timing. Every movement they made gave him new information. Luis decided to create a situation that would make them reveal more of their intentions. While at a local shop, he accidentally left a small note near the entrance. It was subtle, containing nothing threatening, only hinting that someone was aware of their presence and movements. Luis smiled quietly as he walked away. From a distance, he noticed the men noticing the note. Their confused expressions were exactly what he wanted. They whispered to each other, trying to interpret the message. After finishing a small plumbing job at a nearby house, Luis returned to the street. He made sure his path crossed theirs in a casual way. He greeted a few neighbors, carried his toolbox with ease, and even stopped to examine a parked bicycle, as if distracted by nothing in particular. The men watched him closely. Their nervous glances and quick whispers revealed that Luis was gaining control over the situation, without them even realizing it. Luis also paid attention to the smallest details. He noticed which businesses they visited, how long they stayed, and the way they interacted with each other. Their overconfidence had already made them careless, and now it was turning into mistakes. Luis's plan was simple: observe, guide, and influence, all without direct confrontation. Every step he took was designed to make them reveal more than they intended. That evening, Luis visited the gas station again. This time, he carefully placed a small tool near the pumps where they would notice it. It was a harmless gesture, but it suggested that he had been observing them and knew more than they thought. From across the street, the men noticed it immediately. They exchanged worried looks, their earlier confidence almost gone. Luis smiled faintly. The subtle influence of small, clever actions was more powerful than any loud display of strength. Later, Luis returned home to review his notes. He wrote down the men's movements, patterns, and reactions. Each detail was a piece of the puzzle, helping him plan the next steps. He reflected on how careful observation and patience had begun to give him the upper hand. The men thought they controlled the streets, but Luis knew otherwise. His quiet actions had already started guiding their decisions. Before going to sleep, Luis took a moment to think about the coming days. The men's nervousness meant that they were vulnerable to clever influence. Luis did not need confrontation, force, or attention. His intelligence, calmness, and subtle strategies were already changing the situation. The ordinary life of a plumber remained, but beneath it his mind was active, alert, and always 3 steps ahead. Luis lay down, feeling ready for whatever challenges the next day would bring. He knew the men would continue to make mistakes as long as he remained calm, observant, and clever. The town seemed peaceful on the surface, but beneath it, a quiet battle of intelligence and strategy was unfolding. Luis was confident that the advantage was already his, and the men did not yet understand the full extent of his abilities. Luis woke up to a quiet morning, the town still wrapped in the soft glow of dawn. The past few days had been revealing. The men at the gas station, once loud and confident, were now cautious. Luis could sense their nervous energy. Today, he decided, would be the day to take his plan further. Without confrontation, without fear, only clever moves and careful observation. He prepared for his day, grabbing his toolbox and reviewing his notes. Every detail mattered. Where the men had parked, how they reacted to small gestures, the way they whispered among themselves. Luis smiled quietly. They had begun to underestimate him, assuming he was a simple plumber. But every step he had taken had already started to control their decisions. Luis drove to a nearby plumbing job, intentionally taking the route past the gas station. The men were there, sitting in the same car watching the street. Their eyes followed him closely, and Luis noticed the tension in their posture. He slowed the truck slightly, pretending to check the mirrors and gauges, giving them time to notice him calmly. Then he waved politely, showing no fear, no anger. Their confident smirks faltered, replaced by uncertain glances. Luis kept driving, noting every reaction. After finishing the job, Luis decided to visit the market. He carried only his toolbox, moving casually among the vendors and shoppers. From a distance, the men followed, trying to appear casual. Luis made small, deliberate gestures. A quick adjustment of his toolbox strap, a glance at a shop display, a nod to a neighbor. Each tiny movement hinted that he was aware of their presence, but nothing aggressive. The men whispered nervously. Their confidence was slipping further, and Luis smiled inside. At the cafe near the square, Luis paused to rest and observe. The men were parked across the street, their eyes darting between Luis and the passers-by. He noticed subtle signs of panic, the way they checked their phones repeatedly, the way they adjusted their seating positions, the way they spoke in hurried, low voices. Every observation Luis made added another piece to his growing understanding of their behavior. Luis realized that patience and subtle influence were more powerful than any display of force. Over the past days, he had planted doubt in their minds, guiding them to make mistakes without ever confronting them. Now, the turning point was near. A few more carefully timed actions would make them fully aware that their assumptions were wrong and that they were no longer in control. He left the cafe and walked slowly down the street, nodding to neighbors and greeting shopkeepers. As he passed a small alley, he accidentally dropped a note where the men could see it. It contained no threat, only a hint that he had observed their activities closely. The men immediately noticed it, and their expressions changed. Confusion and nervousness replaced their previous arrogance. Luis smiled faintly. His plan was working exactly as he intended. Later, Luis returned to a plumbing job at a local home. From the window, he noticed the men watching the street again, trying to figure out his movements. Luis made a small adjustment to a tool on the sidewalk and glanced toward them. Their reaction was immediate. They whispered quickly, glanced around, and seemed unsure of what he might do next. Luis knew this was the moment he had been preparing for. By evening, Luis returned home satisfied. The men's confidence had been replaced by hesitation. They were beginning to realize that the quiet plumber they had underestimated was far more clever and observant than they could imagine. Luis reviewed his notes, smiled, and prepared for the final steps of his plan. Patience, intelligence, and subtle influence had turned the situation completely in his favor. As night fell, Luis lay down, feeling confident and calm. The town appeared peaceful, but beneath the surface the balance of control had shifted. The men no longer believed they were untouchable, and Luis had achieved that without confrontation. The turning point had arrived, and the men were beginning to understand slowly and quietly that they had misjudged the ordinary plumber entirely. Luis woke early, the soft light of dawn spilling over the town. The past days had been quiet on the surface, but beneath it, a battle of intelligence and patience had been unfolding. The men from the gas station, once confident and arrogant, were now unsure and cautious. Luis knew the final steps of his plan had arrived. Today, he would secure his advantage completely, using cleverness rather than force. He dressed simply, grabbed his toolbox, and left his apartment as usual. The streets were calm, with only a few neighbors beginning their morning routines. Luis moved casually, keeping his eyes on the surroundings. From a distance, he noticed the men's car parked near the cafe. They were whispering among themselves, glancing repeatedly at the street and at anyone who passed by. Luis smiled faintly. Their nervousness had grown each day, and today it would reach its peak. Luis first visited a plumbing job near the town square. He carried his tools confidently, greeting neighbors along the way. The men watched him carefully from their car. Luis allowed them to see him pausing to examine a parked bicycle, tying his shoe and adjusting his toolbox. Every small action seemed ordinary, but each was calculated. The men's confusion grew. They began to doubt their own observations and strategies. While working on the faucet, Luis glanced out the window, noticing the men moving slightly closer. He continued working calmly, adjusting the faucet and testing the water. Then with a casual movement, he left a small tool leaning against the wall outside, in their line of sight. The men noticed it immediately. They whispered quickly, looking around as if unsure what it meant. Luis had planted the final hint of his awareness, a subtle message that he had been observing all along. After finishing the job, Luis walked back through the market. He greeted shopkeepers, nodded to neighbors, and carried himself with complete calm. The men followed at a distance, trying to appear casual, but Luis could see their tension. Their glances were sharper, quicker, and filled with uncertainty. They were no longer confident. They were beginning to realize that the quiet plumber was far more clever than they had assumed. Luis stopped at a small cafe, pretending to rest. He sipped his tea slowly, glancing around occasionally. From across the street, the men observed him, but now their whispers were hurried and confused. Their carefully planned intimidation had failed. Luis had turned the situation entirely without confrontation, without threats, and without fear. His intelligence, patience, and subtle actions had done all the work. By late afternoon, Luis returned home. The street seemed peaceful again, but he knew the balance had shifted completely. The men had started to doubt themselves and each other. Their arrogance had been replaced with hesitation. The town, unaware of the quiet battle, went about its day normally. Luis had secured his safety, his ordinary life, and the respect of the streets, all without violence. That evening, Luis sat on his porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The men had not returned to harass him. Their confidence had been replaced with caution, and they seemed to understand, even if only subconsciously, that Luis was no ordinary plumber. He smiled quietly, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Patience, intelligence, and careful observation had won the day. Luis knew that life would continue quietly, just as he had hoped. The men, once threatening, had learned without words that the quiet, clever, and observant plumber was someone not to be underestimated. The town remained peaceful, the streets calm, and Luis's ordinary life continued, but now with a new layer of respect quietly earned. As night fell, Luis prepared for bed. He reflected on the past days, knowing that careful planning, patience, and clever actions could accomplish more than force ever could. He had defended his life, protected his town, and outsmarted those who thought they were in control. With a final sip of tea, Louis smiled, confident that the quiet victory was complete. The town slept peacefully, unaware of the subtle battle that had unfolded. Louis lay down, calm and ready for tomorrow, knowing that intelligence and patience had secured not only his safety, but also the quiet peace of his ordinary life.